I'd like to begin really by joining the chorus of thanks to John and to Eva, of course, for convening this meeting under quite extraordinary circumstances. Okay, so my title is How Do Shared COVID, and it's all about really how conflict and COVID are connected. What then do they have in common? Well, my argument is going to be surprisingly quite a lot. For a start, both of them are a source of shared suffering in human groups. And in the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion that John just mentioned, we've been building quite a rich body of evidence that shared suffering produces a very powerful form of social glue, which has become known as identity fusion. It's often described as a visceral sense of oneness with the group. Now, my colleagues and I, if I can get these slides to advance, have been studying the causes and the consequences of fusion in a great diversity of groups, from Melanesian initiation cults to revolutionary insurgents, to football hooligans, Muslim fundamentalists, and also with a range of populations that hadn't really thought of themselves as groups before some kind of disaster struck. Now that might be something like, sort of members of a population that just happened to be present when a terrorist attack occurred, through to those affected by the COVID pandemic, which will be one of the sort of focal points of this talk. In a way, I guess this narrative that I'm going to build is about the sort of positive side of some of the things that Denise has just been talking about before the break. Here's the thing, basically, that when we find ourselves with our backs to the wall, whether this is due to being attacked by our enemies or being, sort of affected by some rapidly spreading disease or some other threat to our well-being, it can actually lead us to bond together much more strongly than ever before. When groups become fused through the sharing of sufferings, they're capable of quite extraordinary acts of cooperation. This point is really vital for the policy community to understand. All too often, the powerful social glue that is present in the wake of things like civil war or terrorist atrocities or natural disasters or disease outbreaks is tragically squandered, or worse, it's actually used to fuel social discord. And yet, if only we paid closer attention to the scientific research on shared experience and group bonding, we could potentially harness that kind of social cohesion in consensual ways to heal divisions in society and to motivate more peaceful forms of cooperation. So my job in the next sort of 20, 25 minutes or so is to convey the nature of the challenge as I see it, as clearly as possible. And the first step is really to get our heads around the fundamentals of cooperative behavior from a psychological perspective. The human capacity for cooperation is at the root of many of the most impressive accomplishments of our species, from the evolution of language and tool use through to the construction of pyramids and the creation of amazing things like space stations. None of these uniquely human abilities and achievements would be possible without the ability to work together in ways that are unparalleled anywhere else in the natural world, and which have grown ever more elaborate with the evolution of states and empires in world history. Humans have justly been described as super cooperators, a species that has not only mastered many of the forms of cooperation predicted by games theory, but has uniquely augmented them in heritable cultural systems, progressively increasing the scope and the scale of collective action. This ability to work together often requires the sublimation of personal needs and desires for the good of some larger group or cause. Now, broadly speaking, there are two deep motivations, if you like, for self-sacrifice for the greater social good. One of these, familiar enough, no doubt, is fear. This could be fear of punishment by secular authorities, such as the state police, for example, by moralizing gods, such as the supreme deities of the Abrahamic religions, or simply the threat of ridicule or ostracism or other sanctions imposed by one's peers, such as may be observed in cultures that have very tight norms and limited opportunities for social mobility. Fear is a very strong enforcer of normative conformism and conservatism, but it's not the most powerful driver of self-sacrifice for the group that we know of. Military leaders with first-hand experience of the horrors of frontline combat know that coercion has a limited capacity to motivate heroism on the battlefield. And in fact, the most powerful driver of extreme forms of self-sacrifice is in many ways the very opposite of fear. It is love, love of the group, love of its members, its identity, its values, its beliefs, and its rituals. From the professional soldier who throws himself onto a grenade to protect his fellows, to the suicide bombers of Al-Qaeda, there is a growing body of evidence that willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice is rooted more deeply in bonds with the in-group than it is by fear of any form of external inducement or threat or coercion. The question then is, where do such fanatical forms of commitment to the group come from? Carefully replicated scientific research over the past decade suggests that one of the most potent psychological drivers of extreme pro-group action is a powerful form of social glue, the identity fusion that I referred to a little bit earlier. The fusion construct was first developed by psychologists in Texas and Madrid, using a measure that involved showing people a series of circles with varying degrees of overlap. People were told that the little circles represented them as individuals and the big circles represented a particular group of which they were part. And participants were invited to say which of these depictions of the big and little circles best characterized their relationship with the group. Those who chose the depiction over here on the right of the screen were said to be fused with the group. Now, it's important to note that this concept of fusion is very different from what many of you will be familiar, if you've read much social psychology, you'll be familiar with the idea of identification. And this is really a very different construct. For decades, social psychologists have observed that when people identify with a group, this produces a kind of hydraulic relationship between the personal identity and the group identity. So when you make a person's group identity salient, their personal identity becomes less accessible, and vice versa. For this reason, identification is a depersonalizing form of group alignment. It's as if the group identity eclipses your sense of self. By contrast, when people become fused, the relationship between personal and group identities is synergistic, the one amplifying the other. Fused people say that they personally make the group strong, and also the other way around, that they're strengthened by the group. And this also means that when fused groups come under attack, they take it really personally, and they'll do whatever it takes to defend the group, even to the death. Now, a lot of the research on fusion has focused on its capacity to fuel intergroup conflict by motivating group members to fight and die to protect their fellows and defeat their enemies. Most of these studies have involved measures of willingness to fight and die, often based around trolley problems, in which people are presented with scenarios, basically, in which they could only save other members of their group by throwing themselves onto the track to protect them from an oncoming train. Fusion consistently predicted people's expressed willingness to sacrifice themselves for the group more readily than identification. But critics of the theory pointed to the hypothetical nature of the fight and die measure, objecting that expressed willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice is not the same as actually laying down your life for the sake of your group. So to provide a more compelling demonstration of the link between fusion and self-sacrifice, we really needed to investigate situations in which defending the group was truly a matter of life and death. So with that goal in mind, in 2011, the year of the Arab Spring, as you will recall, no doubt, we went to Libya to find out what motivated revolutionaries to lay down their lives for one another. And there we found civilians turned fighters in their thousands. Actually, here's an example of a sort of impromptu memorial to the dead that was erected in the heart of Misrata in 2011, wall upon wall of young men and boys who died in their efforts to repel Gaddafi's forces. We interviewed a sample of 179 insurgents, all of them members of a paramilitary battalion or Katiba, responsible for prosecuting the revolution that led to the overthrow and downfall and execution of Gaddafi. Using the pictorial scale of fusion, we asked each of these insurgents to say which configuration of circles best captured their relationships with family, with closest friends in their Katiba, with people from other Katibas you'd never met but who fought in the revolution, and finally with pro-revolutionary individuals in Libya who didn't actually fight. We found ceiling levels of fusion with family and with Katiba members, but look, almost floor levels of fusion with those who supported the revolution. So they were on the same side ideologically, but who had not undergone the shared experience of participating in the uprising. Now, a central hypothesis behind this research was that in order to bring about identity fusion, emotionally intense experiences needed to last, to endure in memory, becoming a focus of subsequent reflection, so that they effectively shape one's essential autobiographical self. In other words, fusion is not based just on sharing any old kind of experience, but only those kinds of experiences that become a permanent part of who we are as distinct individuals. We developed constructs to get at this dimension and referred to these as our self-shaping measures and our personally transformative measures. These included statements like, if I hadn't had this experience, I wouldn't be the person I am today. To which research participants were then invited to endorse or not on a scale, a Likert scale, essentially. Now, in the case of our study with Libyan insurgents, we divided the sample of participants into two categories in an effort to capture different levels of emotional intensity in prosecuting the revolution. Roughly half our sample were frontline fighters who endured the most horrific and personally self-shaping ordeals of the insurgency. And the other half of our sample were providers of logistical support to the frontline fighters. So they did things like driving ambulances, fixing vehicles, and that kind of thing. So they provided essential backup, but they didn't endure the worst intense sufferings of frontline combat. Now, to investigate differences of fusion between these two categories of participant, we asked a forced choice question. We said, if you had to choose only one group as the one you're most highly fused with, which would it be? And as predicted, we found a striking difference between our two categories of insurgent. If you were a frontline fighter, you were far more likely to choose your comrades over family than people who only provided logistical support. Now, according to our theory, it was the more intense shared sufferings of frontline combat that produced the higher levels of fusion among frontline fighters. But in this particular study, we couldn't rule out the possibility that higher fusion levels were driving fighters to the front lines in the first place, since after all, Katiba members had some level of influence over the roles that they played in the insurgency. So to adjudicate on this question, we've since run a number of studies with a variety of groups, such as US military serving in combat roles in Vietnam, in Iraq and Afghanistan, showing repeatedly that intensity of experience of frontline combat predicts higher levels of fusion, even when you have no control over your deployment. The idea that sharing traumatic ordeals, sufferings with other people can produce very strong forms of social cohesion is by no means new. In fact, this pathway to identity fusion has ancient roots in human societies and has often been deliberately exploited by the rituals of minority religious sects, warrior cults, terrorist organizations, even elite so-called public schools, as they're called in the UK. And this has been occurring over many, many hundreds of years, even over many millennia, and all around the world. Examples of such rituals include the many extremely painful initiation rituals of tribal groups in Melanesia Amazonia, West Africa, and First Nations groups in North America and Australia. These rituals are often so traumatic that they've been described as rites of terror. Numerous experiments and surveys have shown how these kinds of rituals can have a transformative effect on participants' personal identities and their group alignments, really laying the foundations for identity fusion. In our Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion here in Oxford, we refer to these rituals as imagistic because of the powerful imagery they evoke, which forms a crucial part of the transformative processes by which personal and group identities become fused together. The link between fusion and willingness to fight and die for your group has been documented repeatedly, not only in studies with military groups, but with a range of other populations that condone or actively engage in violence towards outgroups. For example, my colleagues and I have run numerous studies with hardcore football fans around the world, including in South America, Europe, Australasia, and Southeast Asia, showing that the most emotionally intense experiences of soccer supporters give rise to fusion, and this in turn motivates extreme forms of pro-group action, including violence towards rival fans. We found that the less successful teams have the more highly fused supporters and the more loyal supporters over time than the more successful teams. And that this is because actually losing vital matches produces particularly transformative and group-defining memories. It's important to emphasize, though, that fusion among football fans is also capable of producing peaceful and not just violent forms of pro-group action. For example, while some of the most passionate supporters surveyed in our studies were particularly prone to out-group hostility, others actually channeled their love of club into efforts to maintain discipline in the ranks of their fellow fans so as to avoid sanctions for hooliganism that could harm their club's future prospects. These findings fit with a growing body of research showing that the relationship between fusion and pro-group action is mediated by a range of other factors, including the kinds of norms that the group valorizes, for example, violence condoning versus law-abiding norms on the one hand, and perceived levels of outgroup threat on the other. Research in our centre increasingly suggests that fusion can be harnessed in a wide range of peaceful forms of pro-group action, from giving blood to supporting wildlife conservation. We're now starting to discover how shared experiences have also exacerbated divisions resulting from Brexit in Europe and Trump's presidency in the US, but most recently, how global shared experiences of COVID might actually help us transcend those divisions. As an example of how shared suffering, even as a consequence of an outgroup attack, can produce non-violent forms of cooperation and self-sacrifice, consider how people reacted to the 2013 marathon bombings in Boston, in which 3 people were killed and hundreds of others were injured. Our study showed that in the wake of this carnage, where we conducted a survey among Bostonians, focusing on feelings of psychological kinship with fellow Americans, we found that before the bombing occurred, we'd already had measures of fusion with America on the part of average Bostonians. And immediately after the bombing event, I'm sorry, I've advanced the slides too quickly. Immediately after the bombing event, fusion didn't increase. I'll come back to this perhaps a bit later. But what we did find was that the role of psychological kinship mediated fusion's effects on behavior in the wake of the bombing. So we asked people questions about their psychological kinship, their feelings of family, let's say, with fellow Americans. And then we measured willingness to make personal sacrifices to help victims of the bombings. And we found that psychological kinship fully mediated the effect of fusion on support behaviors. Peaceful pro-group action of this kind, even when people have been enraged by acts of violence, has been shown to result from fusion, not only with people from your own community, but even with complete strangers, and even actually with entirely different species. So this brings me to my next slide. For example, back in 2015, I'm sure many of you will remember how people all around the world reacted to news of the illegal killing of a lion at a national park in Zimbabwe by an American trophy hunter. The lion, I'm sure you remember, he was nicknamed Cecil, posthumously became an overnight celebrity when news of his killing was broadcast by the world's media. This prompted tens of thousands of people to write to the conservation unit here in Oxford, responsible for studying Cecil and other lions at this particular national park. Most were asking what they could do to help conservationists to protect lions in the wild, typically offering to make donations of money. I managed to persuade colleagues here in Oxford who'd been working with Cecil to let us run a longitudinal study with a sample of 160 donors to help us understand the psychological impact of Cecil's death and to explore people's reflections on the event during the months that followed. This study helped us to see more clearly how processes of reflection were feeding directly into the fusion of personal and group identities, in this case, leading to fusion, not only with those engaged in lion conservation, but also with the lions themselves, so crossing the species barrier, and especially fusion with Cecil, whose sufferings were felt by many of the donors to be something that they personally shared. Now, understanding these processes is key also to appreciating how events within our own countries impact national cohesion and societal stability. In the run-up to the Brexit referendum, for example, we ran a survey of voters revealing that levels of fusion with the UK were remarkably similar among both Remain and Leave supporters. What differentiated them were their levels of fusion with Europe, relatively high, of course, for Remainers, but unsurprisingly, very much lower for Leavers. After the referendum, however, we've been running a longitudinal study showing how the Brexit result has created deep divisions in the UK electorate. For example, the shared suffering of those opposed to Brexit when they first learned the outcome of the referendum, and in particular, the visceralness of those memories of that fateful day, predicted higher levels of fusion with fellow Remainers, thereby pitting them ever more deeply against the Leave camp. We also ran similar studies to explore the effects of Trump's election on Democrats in the US. Now, in the case of our longitudinal Brexit studies, the aim was to examine the psychological effects of the actual withdrawal from the EU on the part of Remainers. We predicted that the withdrawal itself would be kind of like an imagistic ritual for those people, prompting strong emotions and subsequent processes of reflection capable of driving identity fusion with fellow Remainers. In practice, however, the anticipated ritual didn't really come off as planned, which of course caused our research design to go awry. To begin with, the withdrawal scheduled for 31st of October was postponed, which meant we collected a lot of data about people's reactions to what was essentially a non-event. Then on 12th of December, the general election result provided Boris Johnson's government with a mandate to push Brexit through. But by the time this actually happened on 31st of January, the public imagination had been so fatigued by the sort of elongated process and the news saturation that it too proved to be something of an anticlimax. Then, of course, in March, the COVID-19 outbreak was declared a global pandemic. The UK went into lockdown. And then, of course, at the start of April, the Prime Minister was treated in intensive care for the symptoms of coronavirus. In effect, it seemed that the woes of Remainers had been superseded by a new set of problems, this time shared by Britons on both sides of the Brexit debate. Consequently, we've been collecting data on the impact of various aspects of pandemic threat and its practical consequences in people's lives on their fusion levels with Remainers, with Leavers, with fellow Britons, with Europeans, and with humanity at large. Our prediction is that the most personally transformative shared experiences of the pandemic will predict the most significant changes in fusion. In particular, we expect the shared sufferings of fellow Europeans in countries hardest hit by coronavirus to change patterns of fusion that had divided leavers from Europeans and Remainers from leavers. If we're right about this, it has potentially important implications for the way in which the Brexit process is conducted. But it's doubtful that government policy will be capable of detecting and adapting to underlying changes in the country's group alignments unless the right kinds of research are being rapidly conducted and the findings seriously considered by politicians. Fusion research also has potentially significant implications for public policy on a global canvas. So let me end with a few very quick examples. First, consider the global problem of climate change. All too often, this is seen as a problem posed by and perhaps ultimately best solved by scientists. But while there is an important role to be played by the scientific community and by technological advances, arguably the most important changes depend on global cohesion and collective action on the part of all of us aimed at new forms of behavior. One of the greatest sources of social cohesion that we know about in our species is actually religion, not science. All the world's religions provide scriptural support for stewardship of the planet, yet very few governments or international bodies are asking how we can use or harness the cohesion of religions to address climate change. This is all the more surprising when you consider the demographics. The overwhelming majority of people in the world are religious, roughly 7 billion believers compared with only 500 million atheists. And there's evidence that people make many decisions, including environmental decisions, very substantially on the basis of their religious convictions. Some organizations already recognize this. Religions for Peace, for example, have issued a call on religious believers and all men and women of goodwill to an urgent and sustained response to the challenge of climate change, unquote. The problem is that such calls tend to preach to the converted and don't take full advantage of what we've learned about the psychology of religion and group cohesion. We need to develop a much more specific and targeted approach. Of course, the unifying effects of religion are by no means always global or universalistic. Often they're parochial and sectarian. And as we've already seen, when highly fused in-groups come under attack, they will often stop at nothing to defend themselves. In some cases, of course, this takes the form of violent extremism. Our research suggests, though, that approaches to tackling this problem by trying to de-radicalize would-be terrorists start from the wrong initial premises. If fusion rather than ideology is the main motivation behind violent self-sacrifice, then challenging people's ideologies and group identities is really the wrong place to start. Instead, the focus should be on challenging the sharedness of self-shaping experiences and trying to get people to consider ways of reframing their autobiographical memories. There's also the question of whether people can question and think through from different angles their convictions of shared experience, perhaps simply by talking to other people who've been through what they perceive to be similar experiences. Finally, just as shared experiences may provide the key to defusing extremists, it could also help us to develop diagnostic tools to detect individuals and even whole populations at risk of turning violent. Currently, research on this topic in the Center for the Study of Social Cohesion is being spearheaded by Julia Ebner, who has been studying violent extremist groups undercover on the dark web for a number of years. Julia is trying to develop new ways of diagnosing the more dangerous signs of fusion and threat perception in online chat rooms. And a group of us are also developing what we're calling a volatility index designed to identify populations at risk of turning to collective violence in response to perceived outgroup threats. There are numerous other ways in which understanding social cohesion can help the policy community to facilitate more peaceful and consensual forms of cooperation around the world. But alas, I'm out of time. I look forward to your feedback and your questions and to a longer and wider dialogue about these issues under the auspices of CRIC and other like-minded organisations. As always, I'd like to end by thanking the many students and collaborators who contribute to the work of the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion.